We are starting Unit 6, your very last unit. And so if you will turn to Unit 6 in your handbook. We're starting by learning about the levels of the biosphere. Now you might have learned a little bit about this before, so hopefully it'll just be a little bit of a review for you. When we look at the word biosphere, bio means life, and the sphere refers to Earth. So we're looking at where on Earth does life exist? How far up into the atmosphere does life exist? How deep into the oceans does life exist? And so the biosphere looks at all of the places on Earth where life exists. We can divide the biosphere up into what are called biomes, areas of similar climate and vegetation. And so if you look at this map, you can see that based on the colors, some parts of the Earth have very similar climate and vegetation. Now we want to pause here for a second and remind ourselves that climate means weather. And so when we talk about climate, we don't just mean weather of one day, we mean the overall weather patterns. But when we talk about climate, we include things like temperature and rainfall. Now, the amount of sunlight that you get and the amount of water you get will definitely impact the types of plants that you have. And so when we start to study the whole Earth, we start to really understand that if we have certain climate conditions, then we'll have certain types of plants. If we have certain types of plants, then that will influence the types of animals that we would expect to see. So what we're learning about at this moment are what are called the levels of the biosphere. We can look at the whole Earth, we can look at areas that just have similar climate and vegetation, or we can look at a smaller area called an ecosystem. An ecosystem is formed by the interaction between living and non-living factors in a given area. What does that mean? A system formed. And so when we talk about a system, we're saying it's a defined space, such as the Sahara Desert, or Lake Norman. Those are what are called ecosystems, a defined area. And we see the interaction between biotic, put a star by this, those are living things, and abiotic. Remember the prefix A means not. So when we study an ecosystem, we study the living things, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, but we also study the non-living things like water, soil, temperature, pH, humidity, and we study how they interact. If there's too much rain, what will happen to the ecosystem, the living things and the non-living things? So an ecosystem studies all the living things and all the non-living things in one area. But sometimes we want to study a smaller group. That's a lot of things to study. So sometimes we want to study just the living things, and that's called a community. A community is the interaction of biotic factors. And so when we study a community, we are studying just the living things. So only living organisms. Sometimes we don't want to study all the living things. We want to study just one type of organism, and that's called a population. They are the same species. So for example, we might say all of the wolves, Canis familiaris. And and we would study just Canis familiaris, and that is studying one population. And then sometimes we actually study the niche, which is the total way of life of one organism. So even if we're studying all the wolves, we might want to know what is the way of life of the lead or dominant wolf in the wolf pack. And this can include their habitat, their resource needs, and their other relationships that they're going to form. So at this point, we've started to talk about this idea of biosphere, biome, ecosystem, community, and population. And these are the levels of ecology. And so you do need to know these levels of ecology. We're going to keep going because we're going to talk a little bit about transfer of energy, or what we call trophic levels. Trophic levels are levels of feeding. And again, this is something you've probably talked about in your science classes before. But we want to make sure that we're making the overarching connections to the things that you've been learning all year. All year, you've been learning about what does it mean to provide nutrition. Producers produce food for themselves. I like to think of the produce department in a grocery store. Fruits and vegetables. Producers are plants. Now, it can include things like protists and bacteria as long as they produce food for themselves. And so when we start to look at the ecosystem and this idea of levels of feeding, how do you produce food for yourself? You use energy from the sun. And that's photosynthesis. We learned about photosynthesis, using energy from the sun, carbon dioxide and water to build carbs, to build your body if you are a producer. And that is going to be a transfer of energy, taking energy from the sun and building something with it. Now, consumers must take in food, meaning they have to eat. And we have some different groups of consumers. We have what are called primary consumers. These are herbivores. Now, primary means first. So primary consumers are the first to eat. And so they are eating our producers. They're eating our plants. And so herbivores eat only plants. If you are a secondary or tertiary consumer, you actually eat animals. Carnivores eat only animals, and omnivores eat at many levels. Omnivores, notice there's not a picture of an omnivore on here, but an omnivore eats both plants and other animals. But then we have a really important group that we don't want to forget called decomposers. Decomposers break down waste and dead organisms and return nutrients to the soil for recycling. We're going to talk in the next section about what's called the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, and look at how things cycle. But in this section, we're looking at how energy is transferred. Energy is transferred from the sun to the plant, and then all the way up what we would call a food chain. We have some special rules about food chains, and the first one is what's called the 10% rule. The 10% rule says that only 10% of available energy is passed or transferred to the next trophic level. Remember, trophic level means level of feeding. So if we look at our producers, go ahead and label these producers. Producers are always at the bottom of a food web, a food chain, a food pyramid. They're always at the bottom because they're the base. They make the first food. But when these primary consumers primary consumers go to eat, they don't actually get all of the energy that's there in the grass. Now remember, the producers took energy from the sun, and this is called radiant energy, and it's used by plants to convert it into chemical energy. So we call this energy transfer, because we're taking energy from the sun, and plants, not we, plants and producers build chemicals out of that. That's what builds their body. So here you have your producers, and they've done all this work to put energy in their body. But when animals go to eat them, the animals have to chase the food, or scavenge, or search for food. So they have to search and chase the food. They have to eat the food. They have to digest the food. And so we see that only 10% of the energy that was there is actually available later for the organism to do work. This means that 90% is lost. And so as we move forward to continue talking about food webs and food chains, you do need to learn the vocabulary words and this idea of the 10% rule. You have your summary box, and if you would like, you can answer these questions in your summary box.